Big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Hi, everybody. It's August the 8th. It's David Leese here. I'm your host of Leaders on the Frontier Live, and we're so glad to be able to reach out to you on this beautiful summer day, or at least I hope where you are. It's a beautiful summer day. And I hope you're enjoying the summer with both family and friends, and also have an opportunity to take an appropriate break. So today, I am very excited to have a very special guest on. We're going to talk about an incredible trial that has unfolded over the last several years, namely the Coutts trial, and we'll get into that detail as we get into the nature of it. But it all has to do, at least from my point of view, and I'm curious what your perspective is about the rule of law. Rule of law, we know, is critical to our society. And whether it's working with our police on the enforcement side, or the judiciary, the courts, whether it's our legislators and the media as well, both private and so-called legacy media, and citizens, to be able to ensure that law is exercised in a just manner, a fair manner, a transparent manner, and one which serves everyone, serves society. And so we must all be guardians of the law. And we have a long tradition in our great Anglo-Saxon tradition, going back thousands of years, really, if you look back ultimately to not only the Anglo-Saxon period, but also the Roman period, and back to Greece. There's been many different societies that look at law. And so we're going to dare again to go and explore these issues in a very thoughtful manner. So I am very excited to welcome to our program Jason Lavigne. And Jason, a warm welcome to you, my friend.
Thank you very much for having me. And guardians of law. That's a powerful statement right there. And I
It
couldn't
really is.
agree more. Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Well, and Jason, I really look up to you because you are, I believe, one of those guardians of the law, as you have gone, really, I think, a heroic effort to cover the Coutts trial and to be able to, through your program, the Jason Lavigne program, to be able to look at these very important issues. It's not just this trial, but you've been commenting a lot and trying to bring truth to bear in terms of our public square. And I'm just curious, right off the hand, Jason, how did you get involved as one of these outspoken leaders in our country about these kinds of issues that relate to freedom and our rights and our law?
Well, David, thank you very much. And you're being very generous. But in all honesty, humbly, I really wanted to find out what was going on because I was following the Public Order Emergency Commission, and I followed those 6 weeks every day. And paying attention to what was going on there. And I noticed that Coutts was a major pillar to the justification that was eventually found by Justice or Commissioner Rouleau when he did his report. So I really wanted to go behind the scenes to see what was going on, because all of that was really in camera behind closed doors, and we didn't get to hear that information. So I had to kind of go on a fact-finding mission to go and see what was going on in the Coutts border blockade, because what we do know is what we're told, usually a little bit different than what actually happened on the ground. So I got introduced to many of the players and the family members and eventually the men during my efforts to connect and find out what's going on down there. They were all gracious with their time. So
no, it's amazing, and I have really admired the amount of time and effort you and certainly your wife Paula and so many others have done. Really, your community of listeners have done to really cover this kind of trial. So if you had to describe yourself, I mean, I know you have a legal background, you have done a number of things in your work. Is it fair to say that you were really motivated as a citizen to start looking into these issues and trying to get at the bottom of it?
I'm a curious person, and yeah, you're correct. I do have a little experience with some law. in Ontario, where I used to reside before I moved to Alberta in 2021. So before the convoy in Coutts, I did practice. No, not practice. We'll be careful what we say there. I certainly was providing services in law as a paralegal, a licensed paralegal, and I was very interested in learning the system at that level. So late in life, I went to paralegal school to learn the behind the scenes portion of the law, where it comes from, civil law, common law, all that kind of stuff. And it has helped me to apply it to what I'm doing when I trying to do my journalism, which is really the curiosity portion of me is what's really going on. And then I'm a sharer. So I like to share information as I find it. So becoming a journalist with the legal understanding, at least on a cursory level, when it comes to the process and what's really going on when you're hearing case law and all these kind of arguments, it allowed me to bring forward, I think, a different perspective, one with more of a legal hat than you would find with most commentators. And I actually have a genuine interest in learning the law and what's going on because I like to find problems. I'm a problem and hopefully a solution provider, and watching very closely the proceedings, what's going on, especially the treatment of the men while they were in remand, has exposed a lot of things I think the public should be aware of and possibly demand some reform or change when it comes to the legal system in Alberta and across Canada. And I think that's really was my mission here, was to, as a candidate for a potential MP position, be in a position where I understood things that needed change. So part of the legal system, justice, how it was brought to the citizens, is certainly something I had at least a skill set to take a closer look at. And that did provide me that opportunity here in Alberta. And there's certainly some things we can work on here in Canada in order to provide a justice system, which is a distinction between a legal system. And I'd like to get to a justice system. I think we're a couple steps away from that.
So right on. So you care about being a Canadian, our country, and our justice system. So I think it's a very admirable vision, Jason, that you bring. And so with your help, and I know you've seen this unfold over years now, can you help set up the story of the Coutts blockade and how that unfolded? I know it's a big story. In fact, the senior fellow at Frontier, Ray McGinnis, is about to release a book soon called Unjustified that gets into this story as well. And I know you know Ray well. But in this case, can you help us frame that up? Because then I want to share a clip with the audience about the verdict then. So can you set the stage for this discussion today, Jason?
Sure. So January 29th, 2022 is when the slow roll started down to the Coutts border. There was no plan. There was no organizer. There was no idea of what they were going to do when they got there. They just knew they had to do something. This was a bunch of truckers and a lot of people who were fed up with the mandates that were directed to them. And they were supported by a lot of good people and a lot of farmers. As this event rolled out, there was a lot of back and forth. There was aggression by the RCMP, desire for them to have everybody move, resistance from the protesters on leaving, and their desire to stay there was quite the resolve that they took with them, and they stayed on that commitment. Always was nonviolent, at least from the protester side. And there was definitely a lot of aggression and police enforcement that was available, and sometimes you saw an attempt to execute that against the protesters. For example, one incident would be February 1st, where they started to make their way through a bunch of trucks, including entering them. This is witness testimony in the trial here, including entering the trucks. That ultimately was called off by the RCMP. But we did see a lot of back and forth with negotiations. Sometimes the road was open, sometimes it was closed. The border was open for a while to allow cattle through, because that's the only border that allows cattle. But in either case, ultimately on February 13th, after some investigations, which started, from what we understand, on February 9th, with undercover operatives making their way to the Coutts situation, evidence was being collected and shared, and ultimately a decision was made to arrest multiple people, not just the four that everybody's familiar with, sometimes referred to as the Coutts Four, but a total of 14 arrests that over those 2 days, which ultimately led to 4 charges of conspiracy to commit murder of RCMP officers, which was laid on February 14th, 2022, the same day the Emergencies Act was invoked. Now, there's a lot of people who connect these two events together, The Coutts situation with the Emergency Act invocation, and usually it's connected via that photograph that a lot of people envision when they hear about the Coutts situation, which is a table full of firearms, referred to as a stockpile, and was really one of the pillars again for the invocation of the EA, as it was used in the House of Commons to help justify the decision. Now,
Okay.
finding out really what was going on with this photograph and the people involved, it took 2.5 years. It took a
Wow.
trial. It took lots of pre-trial. And it also took another trial, which is the Marco van Hugenbos, Alex van Herk, and George Jetson trial, which was the leaders of the Coutts situation. They were charged with mischief on that count. Putting all of this together, what we do know after the trials have been completed, there was no violence on the protester side. There was no violent intent on this group, even though they were accused of it, but now acquitted by a jury on a not guilty finding for the conspiracy to commit murder. We now know it was a peaceful protest. It was very much legal, what was going on there with the firearms, which were for hunting and for scoping, nothing else like that. But ultimately, when we get into the decision, you play that video, for 2.5 years, because there was a conspiracy to commit murder charge, that's a reverse onus bail requirement, which means that particular charge, because murder is associated with it, it's up to the accused. In this case, it would have been Chris Carber, Tony Olenek, Chris Lysick, and Jerry Morin to prove to the court that they're not a danger to society. So there's that challenge, which ultimately, as you know, they were not successful at. So the charge that they were originally found not guilty of is the same charge that kept them in remand during that entire time. Whereas normally they would have had bail and they would have been able to proceed with the trial through bail conditions and not in remand. So I think that's one of the injustices we found here.
Okay, so that is really quite a summary of a lot of what's happened the last several years, because this takes us way back. So I just want to recap here. So there's a peaceful protest. And by the way, I'm speaking with Jason Lavigne, from the Lavigne Show, as he's watched this Coutts trial unfold in close technicolor. And so I welcome your questions and your comments. Please bring them forward. Jason has a tremendous amount of knowledge and insight on this. So it's a peaceful protest. And what was the purpose of the protest? Is that clear?
Yeah, the mandates targeting truckers and other Canadians to force them to take the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. And this was early January 2022. So it was also connected with, not directly, but at the same time, the convoy that eventually went to Ottawa as well at the same time.
Okay, so it's the same time as that national group of truckers go down the highway to Ottawa. And we have a situation where the federal government, as we recall, invoked the Emergency Measures Act, formerly the War Measures Act, to, even though really a lot of the protests had wrapped up in Ottawa, the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor that goes from Canada to the United States had been cleared, correct? And if I'm saying something untoward here, just you correct me, Jason. But a lot of this had come to fruition. And then later, this past year, we've had the decision by Justice Mosley that the invocation of the Emergency Measures Act was unlawful. And I mean, my certainly reading of that decision was it was a very thoughtful, insightful decision. But meanwhile, we all remember these images at Coutts very well. The protesters, and then ultimately the display of those firearms out on a table. Yeah. And you alluded to something that's interesting. I understand that those firearms, were they sealed? Like in terms of evidence, you just can't grab evidence. The police can't just simply look at a firearm. You have to seal it. Do you not? Like, aren't there procedures that have to protect evidence here? Was that like more of a display that was made for television, or was it? Can you tell us more about that one?
Absolutely, because the Crown presented the search officer who was responsible for that, and we did get testimony from the search officer that they opened the seals for the photograph, which was staged, and it was a term they also used to stage the photograph for the media, and then resealed everything afterwards. So they did violate some of the standard operating procedures, many of them, by the way, from the moment the desire to have a search warrant all the way through the display of that photograph. Many standard operating procedures were violated to get us to that point. And I think you might be surprised, and the public might be surprised, now that the publication ban is lifted on several of these details, to learn just how many procedures were not followed, all the way down to eating pizza during a search at Joe and Person's place. They
Sorry,
brought food.
can you repeat that? Eating pizza? What do you mean?
The search team ordered and was eating pizza as they were walking through a crime scene. At least that's how they should have been treating it.
And how is that a problem, Jason, to ask a silly question?
Contamination of the crime scene, cross-contamination with the evidence. You'll have grease all over the place, who's handling what, and just the unprofessional level of that, because that is against the rules. You're not allowed to be doing that. But the arrogancy and the unprofessionalism that came along with the idea of doing it and then actually executing it.
Okay.
The testimony we received was from an officer who said he didn't partake in that. He also found it to be very unprofessional and it shouldn't have happened, but yet he testified it certainly did happen. That would just be one of many examples.
All right. So this is kind of shocking. I know many work with many police officers. Most of them, almost all of them I've worked with in my experience have been very professional. So this is disappointing to hear that, Jason. So when we look at the protest, you said earlier that the story around Coutts, those images, were used actively within Parliament at every communications level. And you can see this record clearly when the federal government invoked the Emergencies Measures Act. How was Coutts used to support the invocation of that act and the tamping down of civil liberties in Canada?
The quick answer is, in order to invoke the Emergency Act, you needed to have a national issue, national security concern, or some sort of violent outbreak nationally, not just localized in Ottawa, but it has to be a multi-provincial issue. And in order to provide that, because there really was no violence going on at any location, whether it be Windsor, Ottawa, Coutts, or others, other than sometimes protesters got ran over by counter-protesters like in Winnipeg. Other than that type of violence, there was no violence. But they needed something that was considered to be too big for any province to handle. So this is where the narrative came in February 14th via the RCMP spokesperson, as they came out and laid out that narrative, which was a group of people, highly organized, highly financed, highly resourced, across the nation, which they can't even name them all at this point in time, February 14th, but they believe that they caught some of them in Coutts. So if you listen very closely to the narrative that the RCMP provided February 14th, 2022, right there to all the media, we had a national issue that was violent and ready to basically coup the government. Now, after 2.5 years of not just trial, but investigation done by the RCMP, CSIS, and other teams, that never materialized. There was never another charge laid, no more people of interest. It was never clarified who they were speaking about as suspects on February 14th. There was nobody else brought forward. And then ultimately, after all the information provided by the Crown, the RCMP, including their theory of what's going on, a jury found that there was not enough evidence to come to that conclusion either, because that was the basis for the conspiracy to commit murder of police officers. It wasn't just the 4 men that you all know about. According to the theory of the Crown, this included many people, including outside of the Coutts area itself. But now, after the trial and after 2.5 years of investigation attempts, hasn't materialized. It wasn't there.
So what you've said there is incredibly important. So the Coutts case was on the national stage. This is a big deal because it helped sustain the government's, you use the word narrative, right? The messaging, the headline, if you will. They wanted to blast out across the country that essentially this was a national emergency. And that was the rationale to invoke the Emergency Measures Act. Is that the bottom line, Jason? Is that a fair comment?
That's one of the requirements. Now, the Public Order Emergency Commission made it very clear that CSIS did not agree with the decision because it did not meet Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which was a potential violent act in Canada at a national level. It didn't reach that level. But the media I can tell you right now, based on that photograph and the quick narrative, and I do call it a narrative because this is before all evidence is out and tested. The narrative on February 14th was there's a national concern. We had to take action as a federal government.
Okay, but just slow down for a sec, Jason. So I want to catch something there. So you said that they jumped, they saw this quote evidence being literally on a table, like all these guns, and all of a sudden the narrative is these guys are insurrectionists. They are terrorists. I think even that word was used in some of the media reporting, if memory serves me correctly. And yet it was not tested. We don't know what the context was. We don't even know that that was real evidence. Is that right, Jason? That's your point, right?
Correct. And now we can tell you after the fact, and now the publication bans are released, the Crown used work from the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, so reporting by them, and reporting by Vice Media, which later went bankrupt as an organization. Those two articles are what gave the foundation to the court to go ahead and hold these men as potential terrorists.
So wait a sec. For people who don't understand this, or audience, what is Vice Media and so you said the Anti-Hate Network?
The Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is an organization that has received federal funding in order to exist. Their purpose, as stated, is to investigate and look into and expose groups of hate that could potentially cause violence. However, after many years of the work coming out of them and stuff that has been debunked through freedom of information requests using RCMP and CSIS information, it does show that it's more of a hit piece generator that actually creates very false narratives about the potential violence of and hate of Canadian groups. Now, to let you know exactly how serious this was, a woman by the name of Barbara Perry, who's a self-proclaimed expert in hate and violent extremist groups and stuff like that, was scheduled, and there was an attempt by the Crown to bring her in as an expert witness. So we did have to listen to some of her explanation on her profession and what she's trying to do there. And fortunately, I guess fortunately for the public record and for the sanity of Canadians, she didn't become an expert witness because her definition of what a racist and extremist is very, very low, and it would include you and I. So there was an attempt to bring her in, and fortunately for justice, that was not successful for the Crown.
No kidding. So obviously in Canada, we value the rule of law. Like I think most Canadians are very peace-loving people and fine people. Not everybody, but we live in an incredible country. So you see this all unfold, and there are these serious charges. So do you remember where you were at the time and what your impressions were of this? Like, were you kind of getting on with the narrative, if you will, that, wow, this is really serious, and golly, we should be fearful, if not concerned?
Well, for me, it came a little bit later because, like many Canadians, my focus was on Ottawa and what was going on there, and totally lost track of what happened in Coutts. Coutts was considered like a side thing compared to what was going on in Ottawa. We were seeing pictures of Canadians being beat and dragged and brought into the snow. Like, there were some pretty horrific images coming out of Ottawa that kept us really preoccupied, that a lot of us, including myself, completely lost track of the Coutts situation. Okay. It wasn't until about a year ago, in the middle of the summer of 2023, as I was making my way through the Public Order Emergency Commission witness list, I was trying to interview everybody, that the Coutts men came up. So this was Marco van Hugenbos, which was a witness at the POEC, along with Mr. Jim Willett, who was the mayor of Coutts. So there was testimony around that. So started to poke around. Before you knew it, I got connected with all the right people who knew everybody. And that's what exposed me to that information. Okay. So when I learned at that stage, David, that they were still in remand, and in Canada, you basically get bail for anything, but these men did not, it felt very political. It felt like they were there for political reasons, and they were being held for political reasons. So that was really an unfortunate wake up for me. As somebody who's running for office, I believe in the system. I believe it can be changed. I believe we can do a lot of things and do a lot of work. But I really didn't believe until at that point that our government really had political prisoners. So that was one of those moments where I'll never forget. And
Fascinating.
I couldn't leave after that point. Am I right? Does it appear to be? We're gonna have to see the evidence and see the trial to really understand this one. And I can say in the end, it looks like it. We don't have evidence that like Justin or even Jason Kenney or anybody else provided any input on what happened here, but it certainly feels like political purposes here.
Isn't that something? So you started tuning into the possibility that, golly, maybe something is quite politicized here to sustain a narrative. And so, can you tell us what happened with the four at Coutts, the people? What happened? You said they were in remand. How were they treated? How I understand a number of them were put in even solitary. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the two that really had a substantial amount of solitary would have been Jerry Morin, who was the last one arrested. So he was arrested around noon on February 14th on his way to work as the evidence came out in the trial. So we can now start saying things like that. On his way to work, he was picked up as the fourth one. The other gentleman who certainly has a lot of solitary time is Anthony Olenek. So, and he also has the double unfortunate issue of having digestive issues. So he needs to have a special type of diet, which is not readily available to people in remand. So not only has his health taken quite an issue or quite a concern for everybody and been difficult for him, but also he had quite a bit of solitary confinement. This morning I had his lawyer on the show and she used 90 days, I believe she said somewhere around 90 days in total for him over the 2.5 years of solitary confinement. Chris Lysick, he's a large gentleman. He went through a very traumatic arrest. He didn't resist or anything like that, but I guess in an attempt to deal with a much larger man, force was used on him. So he had to
Force was used on him.
Yeah, to the point where it's been admitted and he's being treated for it, and it's not no cost to him; it's at a cost to taxpayers because it is admitted that there was excess force used on him during his arrest. But also by being a larger man, mattresses aren't the same size for everybody. The thickness is not sufficient for him. The clothing doesn't fit him. The shoes don't fit him. So he had to deal with a lot of things, including he had an knee issue before he went in there that was not being treated the way it would have been had he not been in there. And I think Chris Carbert, I think, is the one who physically handled things as best as you can in given that situation. But he's also the one that spent a lot of time reconnecting with his faith, and he provided Bible studies every single day. He has the longest running Bible program by an accused in the remand center. And the hope is that record holds because that means somebody else had to go through 900 plus days of remanding, which is not the intended purpose of a remand center. That's really meant for short term as you wait your trial or wait bail. It's not a long-term facility. So yeah, they absolutely have to go through conditions I wouldn't wish on anybody. And the Supreme Court does recognize that this is some of the most difficult time a human in Canada can do. This is why it's 1.5 times when it comes to sentencing. So every day it's 1.5 days when it comes to sentencing, and solitary confinement is 2 times. So on this one, Tony is going to be looking at 180 days of credit for the 90 days of solitary, plus 1.5 times the remaining of his 800 plus days after the math is worked out.
So without perhaps sharing over too much personal detail, who are these 4 gentlemen? Are they like employed, hardworking guys with families? Who are they?
Absolutely. These were very family-oriented men. And in fact, it was kind of one of the prerequisites to being somebody that went down to Coutts is you were really concerned about your family and the next generation and protecting them. So one of the prerequisites for basically anybody that went down to Coutts or even Ottawa was to protect others. So they were all family men. Jerry Morin, he worked up on the lines. So he was one of the guys that got up there and fixed the electric lines and helped build and stuff like that. And he had a blended family. So him and Jacqueline Martin, common law partner, brought some children together and had a family. Then we have Tony Olenek, who was the main caregiver for his elderly mother. And in 2017, his father passed away, left them in a state where they were taking care of the farm and the business that they had. So he was also a businessman, up to 25 employees at one point is how much he grew his business before the Coutts situation. And also for Tony, he wanted to really care for his family and provide a future, no matter what that meant. So he was basically a homesteader and preparing to be able to take care of his family that way. Chris Carbert, very similar in that he wanted to care for his family if the future got bad, but he was a small business owner in the Lethbridge area. It was a landscaping company called Season to Season Fencing and Landscaping, award-winning. So the community of Lethbridge awarded him as one of the top landscapers in the area. And he was single father of a young son. So Kyler, who he had since he was 9 months old and was a primary caregiver for his entire life, was doing that. He was taking care of his son and his business and enjoying the fruits of his award-winning labor when he afforded himself some time to go down to Coutts during basically the off season, because he's more of a when everything's growing, but in the winter he had some free time, so he went down there. Wow. And then Chris Lysick has 2 daughters that he was a single father of as well, and he was raising them. And he's a hunter and avid outdoorsman. So he loves to go to the mountains, teach his daughters how to find some game, clean it, and go ahead and take care of their family that way. So very family-oriented men across the board, very hard workers. And Chris Lysick also was studying to be a master electrician. So he's an electrician by trade, and he was working on his master's when he went down to Coutts.
Wow. So what a great kind of a touching introduction, Jason, of these 4 individuals as citizens. So they weren't convicted felons or criminals. They were citizens that we would probably recognize as our neighbors, wouldn't they, Jason?
Some of you hired them, okay, because they were business owners. So Tony Olenek had a gravel company at the time. And of course, Chris was well known in his Lethbridge area for his business. And you absolutely would have crossed paths with Jerry if you grew up around him and his triplets. So there's another male and a female in that family, plus others. And of course, Tony Olenek, he did a band as well. So in addition to his gravel, he was out there playing music, which became part of the trial as well. And then of course, Lysick, if you had an electrical need, that's a guy that you will get it done by. But yes, you would have, other than Lysick, who's a physically large man, he kind of stands out in all crowds. You wouldn't have really, picked these guys out as troublemakers or anything like that, because that's not their history.
But they cared enough to be part of a peaceful protest.
Yes.
And they got charged, as you've overviewed. And it's unbelievable. This trial grinds on literally for years. They're put in solitary. They're drawn out over years. Is that unusual, Jason? Your analysis that why has it taken so long to deal with this matter?
Well, there's really 2 things that are really surprising on this one. One is that they stayed in remand that long, because that is not normal. Yeah. You definitely will see people come out. In fact, while they were in there, they would have some of the harder criminals say, hey, look, just call this guy, 5,000, he'll have you out. Like, as if the men didn't have proper representation. And then these gentlemen would come back again after being released themselves and come back and see they're still there. And that's when you start getting stories out of the remand that, like, okay, even people that go through the system often says, this is really weird, there's something wrong here. And then the second portion of this is because it was conspiracy and because it was murder, it became a reverse onus issue for the men. So when it comes to bail, it's up to them to prove that they're not a danger to society. Whereas normally it's up to the Crown to prove that they need to keep you in there. Mm-hmm. So the challenge here is with conspiracy, you don't need the individual person to have even said anything. If they are part of a conspiracy, anything and everything that others said can be used against all of them. So with all of them, actually, when it comes to their bail, there were words and utterances taken out of context across the board which were put together as a theory, which again, the jury voted not guilty on, but the Crown put forward at that stage. And court has to go with what they believe to be the best evidence and the best interpretation of it at that time, because the trial hasn't happened. So the defense hasn't challenged any evidence. So at that time, the judge has to look at that as if it's true. And if you read and if you go through the Crown's theory, you should be very afraid that these are terrorists. These men were trying to kill police officers and take over the government. So,
right. No, they portrayed them in the darkest terms possible, correct?
Correct. And it's very difficult to prove that's not true, other than saying, well, I didn't do that and I'm not a danger to society, other than, making statements like that. It's very difficult to prove. Yeah.
But they wielded their power as the Crown, and they
sure did
portrayed them in the darkest terms. So let's move on to the verdict. I will have this clip here from Bridge City News I'd like to share with us to overview the verdict.
Okay.
Well, a case we've been following since 2020 reached a conclusion. On August 2nd, the verdict for the Coutts 2, Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek, were read at the Lethbridge courthouse. The two have been acquitted for the most serious charge against them of conspiring to murder RCMP officers at the Coutts border protest. Landon Hickok has been following this case and has more details from the courthouse.
After 2 months of court proceedings, not including pretrial, and over 900 days served in remand, Anthony Olenek and Chris Carbert have been found not guilty in conspiring to murder police officers at the Coutts border blockade in February of 2022. They have been found guilty, however, of possessing weapons for a dangerous purpose to the public, guilty of mischief over $5,000, and for Anthony Olenek, guilty of unlawful possession of an explosive device, referring to the pipe bomb that RCMP found searching his residence shortly after his arrest. Now, the jury was on deliberation since late last Wednesday, and they took over 2 full days to complete their verdict. They even requested an extension on late Friday night in order to complete, where they gave their verdict to a full courthouse a little past 9 p.m. Mountain Time. After the verdict was given to the court, Catherine Bayek, the defense lawyer of Chris Carbert, requested a bail hearing immediately for Carbert, as she stated that the time he has served has already amounted to time that he would have been sentenced of his other charges that he has been found guilty of. And Marilyn Burns, who is Anthony Olenek's defense lawyer, says that while she is relieved that he has been acquitted of the conspiring to murder charge, she said it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that he was found guilty of possessing a weapon for a dangerous purpose.
The conspiracy counts were what I expected in terms of the not guilty finding. The mischief, obviously the guilty, we had invited the jury to convict on the mischief count because of the evidence and the way that it came out as expected. With respect to the possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose, I'm still trying to figure that one out. And that's something that we will be dealing with in the course of sentencing, is trying to figure out what facts the jury must have found in order to find him guilty.
The date for sentencing and bail hearing was set for August the 12th, but has now been changed and is now yet to be determined, in which Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek will figure out their fates, and their supporters are hoping that the time that they will be issued will be the time that they have already served in remand for 2.5 years. From Bridge City News, I'm Landon Hickok.
So there you go, Jason. That's that summary of the verdict. Can you give us your response on those two gentlemen? Of course, we need to keep in mind that the two other gentlemen made a deal. If you can help us understand what really has happened here.
Sure. And actually, we could kind of go step back a little bit to the two men who made a deal. So that was Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin on February 6, 2024. And what I want to highlight here is the Crown dropped the conspiracy to commit murder of police officers in both of those pleas. So neither one of them pled to anything near that. They also dropped possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose to the public peace. That was dropped as well. So in relation to these two men, the Crown at that time agreed that the evidence was not there for them and that a plea was appropriate for those two men. Now, the jury did find that conspiracy to commit murder of a police officer was not proven either, but the surprise to a lot of us, including Catherine Biak there, is the weapons for dangerous purpose against the public peace. We're not quite sure what that dangerous purpose is. And Catherine was on this morning still reiterating that she's still digesting and trying to figure this out. And one of the steps she's alluding to there is there will be a determination, or at least an attempted determination, of what the facts the jury decided were facts in order to get to where they are. So that'll be a nice question that they'll be coming out, whether an appeal's involved or we just hear about it through the sentencing, or at that stage we'll find out more. But what was the dangerous purpose? If murder of police officers is off the table, then what is the dangerous purpose? And I think for the next 3 months or so, we're all going to be trying to figure that one out, because it doesn't really make sense when it comes to the evidence. Either, as Catherine put it during the trial, either it's all or none. And this is one of the few things that the Crown and Catherine agreed on, was they thought either it was going to be all or none when the jury came back. So there was a surprise there, I think, even with Justice Lebrun's, that the jury kind of split the two charges and found guilty on one, but not guilty on the more serious one.
Okay, so I'm puzzled too. I did speak with senior fellow Ray McGinnis, and I want to be careful to speak for him, but he did give me some very incisive points. But first of all, just to recap there, so back on February the 6th, they split the four, right? They split the four, and they make a deal with Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin, right?
Correct.
And for much, like, they basically drop everything so that they agree to a deal of some very minor charges. And they drop the big ones, like including a conspiracy, and like a conspiracy to murder, and also about firearms. And what I find fascinating, and Ray McGinnis says this, how is it possible to say that they could uphold that charge about a weapon if there was no conspiracy to murder? Yes. And none of these weapons were found on these individuals. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
Well, three of the men, well, no, not quite correct. So Chris Lysak was arrested at the protest. He had no firearms on him, but his possession was staying where he was staying, so where he was sleeping. That's where his firearms were found. Chris Carbert was found in the trailer to 12:30 in the morning on February 14th with his firearms and the other gentleman's firearms. Tony Olenek was arrested in the protest, had no firearms on him, but it's the same thing for him and Lysak, it was in the trailer in the town of Coutts. Again, the town of Coutts is a town, but the trailer was not in the protest where the firearms were. It was just in the town of Coutts, so nearby the protest. And then Jerry Morin, the next day, on his way to work, he had a shotgun and a .22 in his truck. Very common in rural Alberta. So he was found and arrested with his firearms at that time.
Wow. So earlier, you made the point, Jason, you used a particular phrase. It seems like these have been political prisoners. What do you mean by that, Jason?
Well, they're in there for political reasons. They believe that what they were doing down for the actual protest was the right thing to do. Standing up against medical intervention by your government under threat of losing employment and your way of life, they felt was an overreach. Now, we now understand this to be quite the case. And we also understood that they were concerned, at least Tony was, that the police would turn on the citizens and become violent. Now, the only problem for Tony is he was arrested 6 days before that actually happened. February 19th in Ottawa, that's exactly what happened. The government did use violence against Canadians, and I think we'll be hearing about that for quite some time as it's being addressed. But back to these men in Coutts, they were there for what the law recognizes, and I believe is true, is a color of right, which means they actually had a legal defense for the mischief portion of these charges, for being there for the purpose of, they believed, was to protect citizens, truckers, their families from not just what they believed to be a questionable experiment, or however you want to refer to the medical intervention, also to the livelihoods of several people. They thought they were there to help protect that. I understand, after seeing the evidence and what was put before this jury, I think, and this is what Marilyn and Catherine are going to be doing for the next little while, is trying to figure out what was in the jury's mind for the dangerous purpose. And that could be the conclusion of, simply put, there's no place for firearms anywhere near an act of protest. So these jurors may have decided, like, whether you were hunting for coyotes or cleaning or scoping, or you just forgot it, take extra precaution not to have anything that could be turned into a dangerous weapon near an act of protest.
Yes, point well taken. So I am talking with Jason Lavigne with the Lavigne Show about the Coutts trial. We welcome your questions. And one question from the audience is, are you concerned, Jason, that we have a two-tiered justice system? One rules for one party and one rules for another. And I want to give you, before I forget, an example, just to dovetail on that audience question. As we know, the history in Canada has been fascinating. We've had the burning of some 90 churches in protest regarding, it appears to be, it's hard to know exactly, the so-called finding of mass graves in Kamloops, which appears to have been admitted now that that's not the case. But we've got the burning of 90 churches. We've got the tearing down of the statues of different historic figures, including Queen Victoria on the Manitoba legislative grounds. We even have the video identifying the people. No charges. We've got people attacking. We've got 20 masked men attacking people who are workers trying to build the Coastal Link gas link, and almost no charges. Like a free ride. You can even stop a national railway and interfere with the nation's business and people's livelihoods, and no charges. And yet on this one, in a peaceful protest, you have the Crown. I'm sure they're throwing millions of dollars of resources. So this question, I think, is spot on. What do you think, Jason?
Well, yeah, I think you actually bring up several major important issues to address, and rule of law is at the center of basically all of them. There's two ways you're applying rule of law here. There is, how is it applied? So when the Crown decides who to charge. So is there two-tier system there? And then you're also talking about when you're in the system, are the rules equally applied to you as well? So as the Crown's making decisions on who to charge, what protests to crack down on, is there a two-tier system there? I think it's worse than that, and I'll get to that in a second. And then the second one is, when you're in the system and you become an accused, is there a two-tier system there as well? Indeed. I think the answer for both sides of that is we actually, unfortunately, have a three-tiered system. The top of that tier are the lawmakers, so the traditional ones that you think, okay, the rules don't apply to them. But the second two are the next tier will be those who can afford the legal system. And then the second or last tier for that one will be those who cannot afford. There's definitely a distinction between those who can afford. If they're playing within the rules for the portion, there's two tiers there. Those that can afford and those that cannot. So overall, I actually see three tiers that is unfortunate, because we're supposed to have one. Because your question was alluding to that we have two and we should have one. But when you break it down to the even affordability, we actually have a distinct third one, which is those who can't even afford good legal. And we saw that with Chris Lysyk. So Chris Lysyk had legal aid. He was not happy with that lawyer. And it took the efforts of many Canadians to come together to raise $200,000 in just over a week in order to get him a lawyer who could challenge the charter violations and the human rights violations that were very clear to a lot of people. So that's exactly what happened. Once Chris Lysyk was able to afford, via community support, an actual really strong lawyer in certain parts of the law, it wasn't until then that he got action on his matter, and he was released within 60 days of making that decision to hire another lawyer. So that actually shows how there's definitely two tiers on that level, in addition to the lawmakers or the governor, the people that are trying to use the law on us. That tier absolutely is outside of the single tier rule of law.
I think that's a very thoughtful response. What's the point of justice if you can't access it because you got no money, right? So 100%. Your point though, Jason, is also very interesting. Like, I look at the ArriveCan app scandal that's going in Ottawa now, where you have tens of millions of dollars being shuffled around. And we're just approaching the tip of the iceberg on that, so stay tuned. But you know, people, I think that Canadians are very fair-minded, but when they hear about this nonsense, it just curls their toes because they look at it and say, wow, the hypocrisy is stunning. The amount of money spent on this trial is not only by the government, the millions of dollars and time wasted, but it's also you can debate that, in my opinion, but you also have the defendants I can't imagine how much money they've spent. And then people even donated to them. Is that what you're saying, Jason? People actually donated to help them.
Yeah, correct. Basically, from when people started to learn that these men were still in remand and they were facing some very hefty legal fees, the community started to get together. And there were hundreds of thousands of dollars raised over the year, 2.5 years or so for them. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. One of the men, Tony Olenek, his legal fees have been made quite public through a lot of information that's come out, and he's looking at well over $700,000 already invested in one lawyer, and not sure exactly if their legal costs are done at this stage, as the men are going to contemplate appeals. They're going to have to put their life back together. And in the case of Chris Carbert, he may have had legal aid, but in Alberta, legal aid is a loan. It's something you do have to pay back. It's not a free ride in Alberta.
I want to ask you a question about the Crown. Mm-hmm. I have an article here from the National Post, Thursday, April the 4th, 2024. And you may recall the date because I suspect you were right there in the courtroom, because you have been like a hero covering this in the courtroom. But the opening, the Crown says, many people were affected by COVID-19 and responses to it. This prosecution is not about that, said Crown Prosecutor Stephen Johnston, turning to face the 8-man, 6-woman jury. He said, this trial is not about people's personal feelings about COVID. This is not a trial about the right to protest. Do you think that was true in retrospect?
Okay, so that was the opening statement for the Marco Alex George trial. And I can tell that by the date and the makeup of the jury. So I do remember that opening statement. And two things I'll let you know before I can fully answer that question is Stephen Johnston did not stick to his opening statement by the time they got to the end. He had a very different case by the time he got to the end. And then the second one is it does apply because that is what would be covered under the color of right. Like, what's the motive? What's the reason you're there?
Indeed. Yes.
So this would be the Crown's attempt to the jury to maybe vitiate or remove that portion of the purpose and the reason why they were there. Now, in that trial, Marco Alex George, the Crown was very successful in removing that narrative out of the trial. The judge did work in trying to keep the politics out of that trial, and there was no defense put forward by any of the 3 men in that trial. So the jury didn't get to really hear the why they went down there. Now, in the Carbert Olenek trial, it did make its way in there a little bit because of the character of the men and the reason why they were there did get put in front of the jury. This was via Tony Olenek's interview with the police officers. So 5.5 hours of his taped interview was played to the jury. And then Chris Carbert took the stand. So he submitted himself to a cross-examination where we got to hear his entire side. And for both of them, they were there for the help of others. They weren't there with firearms for the purpose of enforcing their will, but they certainly were there because they wanted to help protect others based on their belief that the mandates and the overreach, which has been deemed exactly that, overreach now, but at the time, before Mosley decision and at the time before other decisions, they believed that they were doing the right thing. So Stephen Johnston doing that in his opening was a way to remove that portion of what I would call the defense or the motive or the color of right in front of the jury. And he was successful because we do have guilty verdicts on all, actually 5 men when it comes to mischief. All 5 men, so 3 in the Coutts trio and then the 2 that went to jury just now, have all been found guilty of mischief by jury. So that's my response to that one, that Stephen Johnston was trying to eliminate one of the valid defenses of color of right.
Okay, so that's very helpful. So if you look at the verdict, at this juncture and how this is shaken out, they threw virtually everything at all of these defendants, not just the four. Did they really succeed in their mission? Jason, if you look at this now in retrospect, do you really think they succeeded in destroying them?
No. See, I think there's a lot of faith amongst all four men. If you ask each one of them individually, especially when they were still remanded, they will tell you that they were chosen. It was divine for them. And it was the right men that needed to hold that burden for the rest of Canadians, because it would have been a lot more difficult for most of us to not just take a deal or try and get out sooner and give the government what they want just so you can get back home. So overall, I think the men stuck to their faith very strongly, and it's going to assist them. Will there be a transition when they come out? Yes. We saw that with Chris Lysyk and Jerry Morin. It took them a little bit, and I'm sure they're still working on it before crowds was okay with them. And by the way, a lot of people come up to them and shake their hand and say, "Hey, thanks a lot for what you did." That's a lot for people to take, especially when you had a pretty quiet life before that. But Chris Carbert and Tony Olenek, I suspect when they come out, they'll continue to lean on their faith and pray to God that each day they can get through it. As soon as they're reunited with their families, I'm sure things are going to go a lot more optimistic with them, and they're going to be very happy about that. But
what
will
a
their lives
remarkable story.
Yeah, will their lives ever be the same? No. And I don't think it's supposed to. I think Canadians need to remember what happened here. And now the next stage, the accountability stage, to see whether or not the Crown overreached here. And we end up with like a Mosley-like decision on what happened here, or an inquiry into what actually happened here. Because I would call for one. There's enough issues here that there should be an inquiry and possibly a bunch of recommendations that come out of this trial, how we got to a trial, how the men were remanded, and how they were treated in remand. Those are just four questions I think that need to be answered soon.
Okay, so to clarify then, Jason, you would call for an inquiry to examine how this case took so long and how they went about prosecuting peaceful protesters nonetheless. There was no conspiracy to murder an RCMP officer. I mean, these are very serious charges that they threw at these gentlemen, isn't it? And
it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Huge. How would that inquiry happen, do you think? Do you think there's any political will that you see or reflection on this?
Well, I think if our politicians, this would include the MPs, MLAs, and even MPPs, if you're looking at Ontario, this is their opportunity now to stand up and say, look, we were sold a bill of goods at the beginning, which was the narrative that came out of the RCMP and the Crown. But now in hindsight, we realize after a verdict and after the evidence was tested, they were not guilty of those serious charges. This would be a good time to ask for some reform and an inquiry into what went down. I think right off the top, and this is something that Marilyn Burns highlighted on my show this morning, that the Crown, who was involved in the investigation and the charging, so Coutts, they were working with the RCMP, looking over the information to obtain and working with the judicial portions of the process. That Crown was also the same Crown that took it to trial. So one item right off the top there should be a separation between those two. The Crown who does the charging and investigation should be separate from the trial Crown. That would allow a check and balance within the Crown's office, so that if the prosecuting Crown agrees with, after a review of the information provided by the charging or investigating Crown, that there is grounds to continue, well, then you continue. That's one check and balance. Given what we saw in the trial, and given some of the comments out of the justice as we made our way through this trial, I don't think a second Crown who was not involved with the charge and investigation would have come to the same charges, and at least on the serious one, conspiracy to commit murder, because there ended up being no evidence of that, unless you believe the recollection that were not recorded and not noted immediately of two undercover operatives who had contradictory stories and whose notes didn't match their manager's notes. That was really the only piece of evidence that really kept these men there for as long as it did. And when that was challenged and tested in court, the jury found it not to be credible, because that's really, if the jury found that portion was credible, then it would have been guilty conspiracy to commit murder. But with their decision, obviously it's pretty clear now.
No, I think you make some very good points, and frankly, in light of all the circumstances that we've even talked about, like this pathetic effort to drive narrative for political purposes, and the timing of this, and the outcome of this trial, in my mind, begs the question: is this just frankly the use of bald-faced lawfare? This is not about exercising justice. This is about the use of lawfare, using the law to weaponize it against your political opponents, anyone who dare questions the government's narrative. And we all know in retrospect what all happened around COVID-19 on so many fronts was utterly wrong. So, Jason, is this an example of lawfare?
Yeah, we actually called it the weaponization of the criminal code against peaceful protesters, and it's not over. August 13th is when Tamara Lich and Chris Barber go back and continue with their trial, which is currently the longest running mischief trial in Canadian history.
Yeah.
So they still have that to address.
You said the longest in Canadian history.
Longest running criminal mischief trial in Canadian history.
Yeah. And why is that? Why are they stringing this out? And why would they do that? Is that a fair comment or question?
Well, it's a very loaded question and comment, but I can do my best. It does seem like certain trials were stacked on other ones, and this is Canada-wide. So getting a decision quickly out of Arthur Pawlowski's trial helped set precedents for mischief, which was 60 days or so 2 months for mischief like he did. Then we also had a quick trial on James Sowery, which found guilty by jury of almost assaulting a police officer, which helped their narrative as they're going along. But the ones that I think they had less evidence on and less confidence of conviction, you see those ones that were stretched out quite a bit. And there's no way, after seeing this trial, that the Crown was prepared for Chris, Tony, and Jerry in June 2023, which was the original trial date scheduled. We've heard stuff where the RCMP was still working on reports and stuff well past that date. So there was really no genuine attempt by the Crown to be ready on the original trial date, which is June 2023. And that entire year of delay from that original one to when they actually went into trial was all around disclosure, the Crown providing information, the data for the phones, documents that were supposed to be provided, et cetera. The list goes on. So whether there were games, strategy, 5D chess, whatever you want to look at this as, this was not a speedy trial. And as a consequence, these men lost a lot of time as they were waiting for their verdict.
Right, exactly. And this is one of the hallmarks of the rule of law that is being undermined from beginning to end, including the requirement to have a speedy trial.
Yeah.
So this is why your call for reform and by other voices for an inquiry sounds like a really good idea. It begs the issue of accountability of a number of these Crown prosecutors. And it begs the question, who are these people and how are they going to be held to account? Because this is just out of control. So I look at this also in the context that we have a lot of different priorities when it comes to our justice system. And I am just gobsmacked by the use of these precious resources by the Canadian taxpayer to go after people in this kind of manner when we are losing the battle when it comes to people entering our country who are actually known terrorists, including former ISIS people lopping off the heads of their victims, and they are not doing their job. So anyways, I know that this is a larger topic, but it all has to do with focus and the execution of law. So Jason, forgive me for getting worked up so much about this, but does that cross your mind? Like we've got all this money to be spending to create really a political narrative when in fact we've got all kinds of needs to deal with in our justice system, including people who are going into First Nation communities and killing all kinds of people because they're out on bail.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of work, and I would say the last 20 years has exposed it to a lot of us. And this is one of the closing things I'll leave with you, because Chris Carbert, he reiterates this often. If you have the pleasure to chat with him, this is something he'll tell you quickly. He's not upset, he's not mad, and he's not even hurt. He is surprised at the conditions of remand, and he wants to help the men that's going to be left behind when he comes out. His focus right now is to, of course, get back to his family, but there's no revenge in this man. He wants to help from his standpoint, what he saw happen. He wants to help the people in there by some sort of reform and sharing his story so that people understand what happened.
Well, what a story of grace. And my final question to you, Jason, is what can we do as citizens as we look at this story, this case study of so-called justice? What can we as citizens do, Jason? Any suggestions there?
Yeah, the one I'm going to ask everybody to do, and it's going to be hard on this one, is don't flip the page. Don't go to the next story. Stick around here for a little bit longer and take a closer look at this one. Because after 8 weeks of trial for Chris and Tony, I am very disappointed in the activities and capabilities of our RCMP. And when it comes to not just whether or not they were involved in things they shouldn't be doing, like destroying excavators and moving evidence. I mean, I want to be protected. I want to feel protected by the RCMP. And if the competency that we saw here during this trial is the best of the best in the RCMP, which is what you would expect if it's going to be such a high profile issue that they're dealing with, I think I was let down. So I would actually want, this is part of why the inquiry is there. Yes, the man went through some horrible treatment, but I think another thing we've exposed in this trial is we could do better when it comes to law enforcement investigations and how we handle things in the criminal justice system. We could do better. We can get better results. We can get better evidence. We can be better prepared so that when things are bad, churches are burnt or other things, there is a mechanism and a justice system in place that can address all issues, and we can get back to rule of law. So I think that's my biggest takeaway here. What happened to the men is horrible, but what's happening to all Canadians because how our system is built is horrible to many, many more that you'll never hear from.
Well said, Jason Lavigne. I like your call. We can do better. We can't take the rule of law for granted. So speak up, talk with your elected officials, and let's don't change the channel. Let's keep following this story. So thank you so much, my friend, for your insights and your perseverance and commitment to keep following this very important story. So thank you, Jason.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the time, and thank you for taking a look closer at what happened here. It's important. You did a good first step.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for joining us today, and spread the word. And if you believe this discussion is important, please share it. This is very important for the life of Canada and our future. So thank you for joining us today.